quiet my soul, 'cause you're teaching me how to slow down.
Good morning, River House. Pastor Jordan here. We're going to continue constructing our rhythm of life. And again, I want to exhort you this morning that the tempo of this rhythm is to slow down so we can get in step with God. It says in Galatians 5 that we're to keep in step with the Spirit. So I want to exhort you today to think slower, to speak slower, to read the scriptures slower, to talk to one another slower, to drive slower. Slow down so you can catch up with God today. The daily practice that I want to talk about today is fellowship. This is something that's all throughout the scriptures. Kind of cool note about it, koinonia was the Greek term of fellowship, and the fellowship of the early church in the Roman Empire was one of the most baffling things about the church to Rome. They could not understand why people that were rich politicians would have peasants into their homes. They could not understand why these people that had no reason to love one another and be connected were being connected. It was breaking every societal code, stigma. It was just eradicating it. And the Romans could not figure out the fellowship. It was baffling to Rome. And so we as the church are called to embody lives of fellowship, which is intimate connection. This is part of being family, a family of blood, but also of spirit, even more so of spirit, right? So I want to call you to a daily practice of fellowship, right? And again, this is something, it's important to look at these practices like garden boxes, right? Because we think sometimes like fellowship, well, that should be organic. You know, if it's going to be real connection, it should just naturally happen. That is not the truth, right? We live in a world of people that love a lot. Most of us love a lot of people and still have a lot of disconnection in our lives, right? Connection is the fruit of intentionality. It is not just the organic happenings, right? Garden boxes, you have to lay them. You have to put the soil layer after layer after layer and the right thing. You have to water it. You got to make sure the weeds aren't in there. You got to fertilize it. You got to trim it. You got to prune the plants as they start coming out. They are so organic. They create life, but they're very intentional. Fellowship is the same way, right? It's very organic, but it has to be intentionally created. I want to challenge you all to make fellowship an intentional part of every day. And I want you specifically by doing a shared meal. I want you to have a household meal or a family meal. If you live alone, I want you to Zoom call with someone and literally share a meal on a FaceTime or a Zoom. Right? It is so important that we are intentionally creating spaces where face-to-face connection can take place. Right? Many right now in this culture, we're disconnected. I can attest to that in our own family. We've been on a journey of recognizing that in the busyness of all of our lives, we all kind of get our orbits that don't touch very well. And we're journeying and learning how to build connection. And intentionality is where this starts. You have to create space for this to happen. And right now is no better time than to create space. And I want you to share at least one meal daily with other people. And in those meals, I want you to slow down. I want you to think slower. I want you to converse slower. I want you to eat slower. I want you to make the focus one another and not just eating the food. Right? And you say, this doesn't seem very spiritual. No, it's very spiritual. The early church, as I mentioned, what they did when they came for church is they would come and they would eat a meal for upwards of an hour. And then they would culminate. They would go and they would worship. They do the spiritual gifts and then culminate with the Lord's meal. So the whole fellowship of the church was built around eating and dialoguing and connecting intentionally under the presence of the Lord. All right, I want to encourage you to do the same thing. Right, in John 21, I love this. Jesus appears to the disciples on the Sea of Galilee as they're out fishing. Peter puts on his garment. He swims a couple hundred yards to see Jesus. And then it says, when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid and fish placed on it and bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish which you have now caught. Simon Peter went and drew the net to the land full of large fish, 153. And Jesus said to them, come and eat breakfast with me. Come and eat breakfast with me. You would think that Jesus would have something much more spiritual to be doing. He just rose from the dead. But he makes a fire and cooks breakfast for his disciples because he so values fellowship. If this is one of the few stories we have of what Jesus does after raising from the dead, I think he's trying to make a point that fellowship and sharing meals together is a deeply spiritual act that is profoundly powerful. And we see that after this time of fellowship is when Jesus has these conversations with Peter. He gives Peter opportunity to redeem his denying. And he asks Peter, do you love me? Right? Amazing things happen in the fellowship and the conversations that take place. Wounds can be healed. We can be salved for one another. There can be so much can take place in times of fellowship. And I sense that God is desiring to reform connections that perhaps are not as strong as they once were or as they should be. So I want to challenge you during this season, and particularly this season. It might not be feasible in times to come, but right now, learn the wealth of true fellowship. Intentionally create time and share one meal every day with people in your home, with people that you love. Make space for fellowship. I pray that God will richly bless you and that intimacy will form and awaken organically, even spontaneously, as you create time for God to show up and bring the koinonia of the Spirit. God bless you, and we'll see you tomorrow morning.